Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to my talk about the art and science of edible fermentation. I am so excited to have a captive audience to get to talk to all of you guys about chemistry, yeast, everything I love. Okay, a little bit about who I am. So, I got my PhD in chemical engineering in 2024 from the University of Texas at Austin, Hookham. I am a native Austinite. I have been here my entire life. But I've actually never heard of this talk before. This is actually my first time knowing about this talk, and obviously my first time attending and speaking. Okay, so another thing about who I am a passionate home brewer. So I mainly delve in sourdough and kombucha fermentation. Beer is next on my list. I haven't actually gotten around to it, but I love home brewing, super passionate. Who I am not. This is also a really important thing to note, right? I am not a registered dietitian. I am not a medical doctor. And this is not medical advice, right? This is my best way to communicate what I know about fermentation to a really excited audience, and I'm doing my best, but please don't, do something nuts and blame it on me. That wouldn't be very nice. Okay, so I want to go over and start my talk with a brief overview of life. So this may sound a little bit like a high school biology lesson, but again, captive audience. So let's start with the two main classifications of life. That's prokaryotic life and eukaryotic life, right? So prokaryote is sort of a combination of two ancient Greek words, pro, meaning before, and karyon, which means nut or kernel. And you might be wondering, well, what is a nut or a kernel in this context? Well, it refers to what's called a nucleus. And nucleus is actually a Latin word also for nut or kernel. And basically where it is it's a little spot in your cell, in a cell, a single-celled organism, and multicellular organisms, where the DNA is housed. And so prokaryotes do not have nuclei, right? They just sort of have this big bag of all of these chemical reactions happening within your cell wall, your cell nucleus, and so everything just kind of floats around. You can sort of think about this like a studio apartment, right? You've got your bathroom, you've got your bedroom, you've got your kitchen, all kind of there, all kind of hanging out, mixing together. Sort of a simple manner of life. And so the two main classifications of prokaryotic life is first, bacteria, and these are one of the main categories of food fermenters. And then we also have archaea. I'm not going to really talk about them in this talk, but trust me, they are also very cool. Okay, so we talked a little bit about prokaryotic life. Remember, prokaryotic life does not have this nucleus, this karyon. Eukaryotic life does. And eu is the Greek word for good. So it's good that we have a nucleus in some sense, because more advanced life, which generally eukaryotic life is more advanced, needs this nucleus, this compartmentalization, in order to do more complex chemical reactions. And some examples of eukaryotic life, we have fungi, my favorite. That was what my PhD was in. These are another type of food fermenters. You'll notice I have a picture of a mushroom. Mushroom are a type of fungi, but fungi are actually a very broad class of life. Also, molds are considered fungi. So, fun fact, love molds. Some molds, not all molds. Algae are also a type of eukaryotic life, as well as plants, animals, and then also humans. Okay, so now I want to give a brief overview into fermentation as it relates to human history over time. Okay, this was supposed to animate in, but we're seeing it all at once. What we're seeing on the left-hand side here is sort of one of the first recorded instances of fermentation as it interacts with humans, and that was in 6000 BC with cheese in Iraq. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I got that right. Then we get to around 4000 BC. There's evidence that Egyptians were using fermentation to make beer and some sorts of alcohol. And then fermentation continues with the Irish whiskey industry, and then some other key developments like the discovery of dahi and the process to make that. And then it really hits its sort of go period when Louis Pasteur develops pasteurization, which is, as you can probably imagine, named after him. Why is pasteurization so great? So when you're doing fermentations, right, you have no idea what has really happened to the food that you get before you see it, right? It could have gotten, I don't know, if you're doing a fermentation with milk, the cow was sick. Maybe someone spilled some dirt into something. You don't really know what's going on, right, before you get your food substrate that you're fermenting. And so it's really, really important that we are able to neutralize anything that's bad in your, again, food substrate, whatever you're fermenting with. So pasteurization is sort of a way to wipe the slate clean, right? We're able to neutralize any potentially bad microbes and introduce helpful microbes to create whatever it is we're wanting to make. So big shout out to pasteurization, really, really helpful in modern life. Oh, now it's animating in. Okay, so now I want to talk about fermentation, specifically microbial fermentation. And so I think this definition I have behind me is a really helpful sort of couple liners. And note that in this sentence and throughout the talk, I'm sort of, how do I say this? I'm making some generalizations just because I'm assuming we have an introductory level into this topic, and I don't want anyone leaving because I've been yapping about chemistry too much. So what fermentation is, it is the breakdown of carbohydrates. A good example of that is sugars into smaller molecules to produce energy. And typically, but not always, it's in the absence of oxygen. So a common example that I know I'm familiar with because I had some tonight is brewing beer with yeast, which is, again, a type of fungi, and would not be a chemical engineering talk without at least one chemical structure. I wanted to sort of show molecularly what that is. So you can see here we have a structure for glucose, which is a common sugar that is used in fermentation. Through the process of glycolysis, which releases some ATP, hopefully you remember what ATP is from your biology days, adenosine triphosphate, we get this sort of intermediate chemical known as pyruvic acid. And that process isn't exactly fermentation, that's just sort of prepping our substrate. But what fermentation is the breakdown of that pyruvic acid into these small chemicals, these chemicals that we know well, that are really, really important for beer, right? And that is ethanol, or alcohol as it's traditionally known, and carbon dioxide. So just to sort of summarize this slide, what microbial fermentation is, it's breaking down carbohydrates or sugars into these smaller building blocks. It's beneficial for microbes to do this because it gives them energy, and it can also be really tasty, right? Okay, so I now want to go over a Venn diagram of some related but also distinct terms that may be helpful for this talk. So we've talked a little bit about what fermented foods are. Again, this is just a food that has had some sort of fermentation in its making, its creation, right? These are distinct but related to probiotic foods and prebiotic foods, right? So probiotic foods, you can think of a probiotic food as a food where there is a live and active organism that has been shown to have some benefit to human health, right? A prebiotic food is a food that is good for the microbes in your body. And the main one that I can think of in that case would be like fiber, right? These fiber sodas we're drinking are just fiber in general. Side note, if you're not supplementing with fiber, highly recommend it. No one has enough fiber in the States, really. Okay, so now I would like to talk about some examples of prokaryotic fermentation products. So I have this fun little chart here and a lot of pictures. All of these pictures that I'm about to show were sourced from Wikipedia, I think. So, okay, the first sort of microorganism that's used in edible fermentation, that's a prokaryote, is this sort of group of, I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this. There's like groups and multiple single organisms, but it can be lactobacillus and lactococcus. And it's these really small rod-like bacteria shapes that are mainly used in the production of dairy products. And what they do is they break down glucose and other 6-carbon sugars into these smaller molecules like lactic acid, which is, you can think of this as sort of this tangy flavor. And that shows up in things like cheese, in things like yogurt and sourdough, as well as kimchi and sauerkraut, which are some of my favorite fermented condiments. Another prokaryote that is commonly used in edible fermentation is, I want to get this name right, so I want to remember, Acetobacter. And Acetobacter is commonly used in industrial processes to produce acetic acid, which you may know as vinegar, and this is sort of more of a tangy flavor. And like I said, this is in vinegar, and then also my one true love, kombucha. There's sort of that tangy flavor really comes from these prokaryotes that are producing acetic acid in your fermentation. Okay, now I want to talk about some eukaryotic fermentation products, such as yeast, my one true love. So this is the same image that you saw in my cover slide. This is a microscope image of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the most commonly known yeast. It's often called baker's yeast, and that's because it's used in bread as well as alcohol, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae can be used to produce ethanol and carbon dioxide, sometimes just one, sometimes just the other, sometimes both. And it is commonly used in beverages like beer, wine, and also sourdough. Sourdough, typically, you have a lot of different cultures kind of all hanging out together, doing their own thing. Another type of microorganism, a eukaryotic microorganism, wow, big word. A eukaryotic microorganism is Penicillium species, and these are used mainly in the production and aging of these blue cheeses, right? And so they have these methyl ketones, this really pungent aroma that to me is delectable, but to some people is really just not their bread and butter. And again, like I said, this is mainly in blue cheese. The cheese I'm actually showing on the right here is a Stilton cheese, which some people believe can cause nightmares if you eat right before bed. So if you want a fun homework assignment, for some reason, if you want to give yourself nightmares, you know what you're doing after this, right? Okay, so I've talked a little bit about how fermentation has been used in food to produce different chemicals, but it can also be used to break down sort of these complex I don't know, I'm trying to think of the right word, these complex formations of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, right? And we see that in fermented foods like miso, like salami, soy sauce, tempeh, and cocoa powder. Believe it or not, cocoa powder, most commercial cocoa powder is actually fermented before it appears on your shelves and in your home. So microbes are really, really good at breaking down really complex structures of chemicals into smaller, more digestible, and often tasty chemicals that we can use for food or for other things. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about why you should care about fermented foods, why they're good, what their benefits are. And again, I am not a doctor, I am not a dietitian. This is just my consensus of the literature and what we know right now, right? So they're often really nutritious and nutrient dense. They may reduce the risk of certain types of diseases, and they may improve your gut health. This is a really, really important thing just for general health, is thinking about your gut health. I'm a super big fiber proponent, in case you haven't noticed. And they also may assist the immune system. So really, there's a lot of really great things that can happen if you eat fermented foods over a long period of time, and again, as part of a healthy and balanced diet. Okay, we're gonna get into a little bit of a pickle about pickles. Believe it or not, the vast majority of pickles that you see in the grocery store are not actually fermented. And I don't know about you guys, but this absolutely shocked me when I learned this. I was like, well, of course it's fermented, right? It's a pickle, right? But no. So let's see. This is sort of an important distinction, right? These pickles have vinegar, which is a fermented food, right? Vinegar is fermented, but the vinegar fermentation finishes before it actually hits the pickle, right? And this makes sense if you're producing something at scale, because you want everything to be really controlled, right? You want everything to be controlled, clean, and pristine. That's not really how life works, right? If you can just get your vinegar, no microorganisms, stick it in some cucumbers, boom, you're good, right? But that is not necessarily fermented, right? It is a food that contains a fermented element, but it's not a fermented food. And obviously, there's no live microbes in there. Okay, so if you are interested in getting pickles that are actively fermented and may have live and active cultures, It's really important to look for how the pickles are stored, right? So if the pickles are in a refrigerated environment, that is definitely the most likely for microbes to still be there. You can also look for signs like contains live and active cultures. If you see something that is quick pickled, so that's probably a sign that someone just put vinegar and a cucumber or another vegetable in a jar and called it a day. Not saying that that is not also great, it's just not a fermented food. Okay, kombucha, love her. Scooby-Doo, what are you? So friends have been absolutely terrified of my SCOBY over the years. What is a SCOBY? Just so everyone's clear, it is sort of the thing that births kombucha. It is this consortium, actually, it is a symbiotic consortium of bacteria and yeast that is what is actually causing all of these fermented flavors. And it is used in kombucha brewing. I have just sort of a stock photo of what a SCOBY looks like. And the scientific term is a cellulose pellicle. Wow, messed that one up. But it's sort of like this, you can think about it like a gelatinous hockey puck. It's this really nasty, sort of interesting thing that has really grossed out many a roommate. And the SCOBY, it's actually really easy to brew to get a SCOBY brewing kombucha once you get it going. You really just need black tea, sugar, and water. And what you'll do is you'll basically brew tea, like you're brewing really sweet tea. Make sure you plop your SCOBY in your liquid, add a little bit of the previous kombucha batch that you've made, and then just hide her in a corner and wait for a week. And then boom, you get kombucha. I really, really hope that this talk inspires at least one person to Google how to make kombucha on their own, because it's really easy, it's really rewarding, and it's a lot of fun. So I can talk about this after, but love kombucha, fermenting, and SCOBYs in general. Something that I didn't know is that it's really important that SCOBY has caffeine in its fermentation, and that's because it's a really important nitrogen source for a lot of the different microbes that make up this beautiful SCOBY. Okay, so what's next for fermentation? I'm going to do a little bit of a shameless plug here. I realize this is kind of an overwhelming figure, but I made this figure. This figure was in one of the articles I wrote during my PhD. So my PhD was about yeast metabolism, but not for edible foods. It was for chemicals, right? So my PhD was about saying, okay, we know we can make really interesting chemicals that are used in food from microbes, right? So that would be ethanol, that would be carbon dioxide, lactic acid, like I've talked about. What if we could also make larger chemicals at scale? And then my PhD specifically was about what if we can do that with waste too? What if we can grow our yeast on waste sugars, waste oils, instead of these pristine sugars that have to come from somewhere, and add value to the world? So I really, really hope that in the next decades or so, we see fermentation play a larger role in society, and I just think it's the coolest thing ever. Okay, so I really hope this talk inspires you to try some more fermented foods, so I just want to talk about some grocery store reminders and things to look for. First off, not all fermentation is good for you, right? If you are at the store and you see a container that looks a little bit funky, looks like something inside has expanded, please do not eat it. That could be potentially really dangerous. Also, I just want to be super clear that fermented doesn't always necessarily mean healthy, especially if you are needing to watch your salt intake, and a lot of fermented foods do have a high amount of salt in them. That's not a comprehensive example, just a simple example. And again, as I believe I said earlier in this talk, if microorganisms are present and you're wanting to eat more fermented foods with live microorganisms, look for the phrase contains live and active cultures. This can apply to fermented products, or it can apply to probiotics. But this is a key phrase to look out for in addition to refrigerated foods. Okay, now, it wouldn't be a nerd talk without homework, right? I really want you all to go out and try some fermented foods. So this image I'm showing is an image taken by a reporter at the Austin American-Statesman depicting some kimchi on bagels from my favorite fermented food restaurant in Austin, which is called Casper Fermentables. I promise I am not sponsored by them. I'm just absolutely obsessed with them. They have sourdough cinnamon rolls, kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha, focaccia, literally anything that you get there is delicious. And if I can use my chance on the stage to bring them some more business, 10 out of 10. Let's see what else. And like I said earlier, if you're interested in getting into fermentation, I can talk with people after about the resources I used to get into brewing kombucha as well as sourdough starters. But really, Google is your friend. You can Google things, you can buy all sorts of different starters online, and it's not as scary as it seems to start your own fermented foods. Okay, this I'm not expecting you to read, but in the way that I was compiling this talk, I read a whole bunch of different literature sources, and I wanted to give them a lot of credit for everything I was able to pull together, as well as the images I use in this presentation. They were either sourced from Wikipedia under the Creative Commons license or other open source image websites. And right before I get to questions, I just want to thank everyone for being here. I really want you all to do your homework, and I want to thank our staff, our hosts, and our interpreter for all of their amazing help. Thank you all.
All right, fantastic talk. Who has the first question? All right.
Thank you for the presentation, Sarah. If I'm getting into home fermentation, how can I be sure that I'm cultivating these good bacteria and fungi cultures rather than something nasty like botulism or a harmful mold?
Thank you, Joseph. That's a great question. To be honest, Reddit was the easiest way for me to figure out what was funky. If you go, there's a subreddit for like any fermentation product ever, and if you just go and scroll through them, you can look and sort of see what your culture is supposed to look like. That's a really helpful way to compare what you've made with others. When in doubt, throw it out, right? And then also, when you're starting a new fermentation process, if you make sure that you have a lot of the previous fermentation, so whether that be kombucha or sourdough starter you're feeding it, making sure you have a lot of that previous fermentation in your new one will give the good bacteria and yeast a better chance of sort of taking over the dominant culture. But I like to remind myself that fermented foods existed a lot longer than we knew what sterile technique was, right? So if humanity's made it over 6,000 years plus, then we'll probably be fine. But it's good to be safe. So thank you.
Next question. In the back.
So I was going to ask, have you ever partaken in any of some more extreme fermented foods like that Swedish tinned fish surströmming or anything like that?
Great question. It is on my bucket list, but I have not yet. My brother is also trying to get my family into, I'm afraid I will mispronounce it, so I'll spell it, Natto. Natto? Yes, okay, I'm hearing natto. But no, on my bucket list, but not yet.
Yeah, the Iceland, I think, makes this fermented shark in cans. Yeah. Next question.
First off, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I was really interested in some of the waste disposal stuff you said about fermentation. Do you know any first steps that have been made in that industry, or like anything I could follow online?
That's a great question. I actually cannot think of anything off of the top of my head that you could follow online, which is really shocking to me. But I do know that the major industrial areas that have been sort of the most explored is like biomass. So basically you're taking a whole bunch of like brush, grass, twigs, stuff like that, breaking it down and fermenting it. If you're interested, I would suggest going on Google Scholar and researching waste valorization is a key term, or microbial fermentation of waste, stuff like that. But it's a pretty new field. Again, my best understanding, but.
Great. All right. I think we're done. Thank you very much, Dr. Sarah.